The Judicial Services Commission has agreed to rerun interviews for Constitutional Court judges of their settlement with the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, that's CASAC. So in court papers, CASAC sought to have the process nullified on the grounds that the JSC did not deliberate properly, I beg your pardon, on the performance of all the candidates. Now, the settlement means that the shortlisted names submitted to President Cyril Ramaphosa have been set aside and fresh interviews will now have to be conducted. What should you and I think of this? Let's bring in Chris Oxtoby. He's with the Democratic Governance and Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. He's actually been following these developments for quite some time. And as you can see, he joins us via our video link. Chris, great to see you. Thanks for making time for us here on the AM report. You've written quite extensively about the importance of transparency when we look at appointing people to our judiciary, essentially judges. And in fact, you cite the Lilongwe principles and guidelines, which also explains this quite a lot. What would you say to people who are of the view that understanding the political leaning of candidates is in the interests of transparency?
I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that point necessarily, but I think doing that has to happen within a framework where there is fairness to the candidates in terms of the scope of those questions. I think what we saw go really wrong in the April interviews that prompted the CASAC litigation was that the questioning became something of a free-for-all, that there seems to be no standard by which those questions can be measured. There seemed to be problems with the extent to which candidates were given prior warning of adverse comments that might be coming their way. And I think the danger with not doing that and simply leaving the questions open to go wherever commissioners see fit to take them is that the idea of sort of political views and political leanings can be quite an elastic term, and so I think you need to establish a framework to make sure that candidates have a reasonable expectation of what they can expect to be asked of them. Of course, judicial office is extremely important, and we should expect that our potential judges are appropriately and rigorously scrutinized. But I think that can't be unconstrained, and I think that the problem of the April interviews that CASAC set aside was that there was really no constraint on those lines of questioning.
I mean, you, for instance, are speaking of adverse comments that came the way of the candidates in April. That too may be viewed as an elastic term, to borrow your words. How far back do you reckon the tightening of the knots here should actually go?
So, I mean, in terms of how far back, I mean, you mentioned that I've watched this process for some time, and I think a consistent problem that has been the case with the JSC for as long as I've watched it is that the Commission has never gone very far to identify what exactly it is looking for in its judges, so what criteria it is looking to apply. And flowing from that uncertainty, obviously if you don't have a clear sense of your specific criteria, then you don't have a clear sense of what is an appropriate and an inappropriate question to ask. So I would say what's really important for the JSC to do right now to avoid a challenge like CASAC's coming up again in future is to have a discussion which looks at firstly the criteria in the Constitution, which are quite broad, and says, okay, how do we interpret those criteria, and how do we, what else are we looking for that might go beyond that, and to articulate them so that everybody knows what to expect from the JSC. So write them in a policy document or some kind that's made public, and then to really think carefully about what that means for the kind of questions that are appropriate or inappropriate to ask during an interview setting, because you'll see in the interviews in April and in the deliberations from those interviews, the JSC commissioners will sometimes debate among themselves as to, well, is that question all right, is it not? And there doesn't seem to be a guiding standard by which they're actually making that decision. So this is, I think, really, really important for the JSC to do going forward.
But determining that criteria is also an equally contentious issue, isn't it? For one,
Yes,
for
absolutely.
instance, if the objective is we want to ensure X number of, for instance, black people make it into the Constitutional Court, that has implications about how all the candidates are treated during the interview process. How do they navigate that incredibly murky water in a context where, again, we know that there's a great push, rightly so, for transformation within the judiciary?
Yes, absolutely. And in the existing the criteria that we do have, one of the provisions of the Constitution expressly provides that they have to take into account the need for the judiciary to make up the racial and to represent rather the racial and gender balance of South African society. And of course, I mean that as you say, that is elastic because that's also a changing standard, and the racial and gender composition of the judiciary now looks very different to what it did at the beginning of the Constitution. And there was some debate in the April interviews about what exactly that demand for broad representation means now that the judiciary is a lot more representative, particularly of black South Africans, than it used to be when that constitutional provision was drafted. So it's, as you say, it's contentious. It needs a flexible standard, but I think it needs something more than the JSC sort of making it up on an ad hoc basis as it goes along, which frankly seems to have been the case in many of the recent rounds of interviews. But you're absolutely right that it is something that is going to involve sensitivity and is going to involve a degree of flexibility. But it's really important that the JSC does some thinking and some discussing with themselves and with each other as to what they see their goal being at the moment.
Very quickly then, Chris, CASAC has been very vocal against so-called political questions being posed to some of the candidates. The politicalization of this process has been a major issue. How does the JSC insulate itself from that in a context where it's important to have the participation of public office bearers who, in our context, are most likely to be politicians to begin with?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I think that you have to go back to first principles and say, well, what do we actually look for in a judge? So again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important to identify your criteria. Once you've done in the course of doing that, then you can have a discussion and an engagement with what exactly are political views that we might say are beyond the pale, and what are political views that we think we can allow a reasonable level of disagreement. And of course, the difficulty is firstly in defining political. I mean, I don't think one wants to get into a discussion in judges' interviews, obviously, about voting for individual parties or party political positions on that, on issues of the day. But at the same time, there's a range of other, there may be, a case of looking at candidates' views on questions like land reform, which would be also, I think, regarded as political debates, but it may be appropriate to get some sense of how candidates see that issue, without, of course, asking them to prejudge future cases, which is another thing that one has to be sensitive to. So I think one has to strike a very careful balance. But until the JSC itself has done the work to identify more detailed criteria and therefore what appropriate lines of questioning are and aren't for them to ask candidates, this kind of problem is likely to reoccur if it's left to be done on an ad hoc basis.
Absolutely. I certainly get a sense that a whole lot more thought needs to take place, hopefully the kind that will help us avert getting to where we essentially are with these interviews. For now, let me thank you for your time. Really appreciate your insights this morning. Chris Oxtoby is with the Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at the University of Cape Town. Once again, thanks very much indeed.